Hi, I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of the Bulletin. Here's a short clip from one of our segments in this week's episode.
Trey Yingst, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks for having me.
Let me start. Actually, I want to start. There was a story you tell early in the book that I just loved, and it's about your grandmother and kind of how your grandmother's influence maybe led you to the work that you're doing now, into places of danger at times. Would you mind sharing that story with us? I think it's a great place to start.
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up traveling the world with my grandmother and my father and mother as well. And it exposed me to a lot of different cultures and places and people. And I talk about this a little bit in Black Saturday to give the readers an understanding of where I came from and how I got into this line of work as a war correspondent overseas. And the story that I tell in Black Saturday is a time where my grandmother and I went to Egypt when I turned 16. It was sort of a trip that I'd been looking forward to my entire life. I was always interested in ancient Egypt and Indiana Jones. And while we were there, my grandmother had a heart attack and a stroke. And I talk a little bit about how this actually linked to my initial interest in journalism, because on this trip, I was documenting and writing notes of where we were traveling to and what we were seeing in this far off land. And it's so interesting because now my life is so focused on storytelling. And 15 years later, I'm a journalist by trade and traveling in the Middle East once again, telling these stories.
And when you say as well, like when she died, you buried almost all of those notes with her, and then the last one you floated down the Nile. I imagine a while later.
Yeah, I took these notes in an effort really just to remember the trip with my grandmother. And whenever she died, I remember my parents coming to me and saying that you can bury something with her. And that was the first thing that came to mind with the notes from Egypt. But I wanted to take one page back to Egypt. Yeah. And it describes seeing the pyramids of Giza with her. And I floated that page on the Nile as sort of a symbolic gesture and goodbye.
Yeah, it's a beautiful image. Well, let's dive into the story of the book. Let's start by talking about October 7th itself. How did that day begin for you?
So I got a phone call on October 7th at 7:03 in the morning from my producer, and she didn't have a lot of information, but she knew something was happening in the South. And we've covered so many stories and rounds of conflict between Israel and Gaza. And so my initial thought was that this was no different from the other rocket fire we had seen into southern and central Israel. And I'd been inside Gaza many times reporting on the story there. It was one of the first foreign assignments I ever had when I was 20 years old. And so I knew the story very well. And initially, this seemed that something significant had happened, but at that moment in my apartment in Tel Aviv, I couldn't have imagined that it was the infiltration that we ultimately come to learn about later in the book. And so we did what we do. We responded to the breaking news and we headed toward the Gaza border, not knowing that we were driving directly into a massacre. And when we got there, the picture becomes clearer that Hamas had actually infiltrated into southern Israel, and all of that intense rocket fire that was taking place overhead was being used as cover for Hamas and Islamic Jihad to go into these communities along the border and slaughter civilians in their homes.
You know, you describe at one point seeing an Israeli who was being kidnapped by Hamas, and you just say that didn't fit. And it struck me as I read that, because we've now lived for the better part of a year with initially more than 200 hostages in Gaza. And yet I think part of what the book highlights, and part of the value of the book is really it exposes the confusion of the day. It also exposes the lack of preparation, right? So when you say it didn't fit, I think that's an important note. What was it about that didn't make sense at the time?
Hamas had previously launched small and limited cross-border attacks. We had seen the type of rocket fire that was unfolding, not at that extent, but significant rocket fire into Israel. So those things all made sense in the scale of an attack at the time, what we knew, the information we could gather then. But I describe in the book seeing this photo that was actually sent to me by a source inside Gaza of Hamas fighters holding an Israeli and dragging him back into the Gaza Strip. And this was a moment for me where I realized, okay, something's off here. to take hostages into Gaza. That had also taken place in the past, but not during a coordinated attack at this level. And so really the book is a real-time progression of my team and I putting the pieces together of what's happening in a really complex puzzle, but also other people putting the pieces together. Civilians, soldiers, police officers, Palestinian civilians, Palestinian doctors, everyone on that day trying to understand what's happening in real time. And I try to weave these stories throughout the book using my story as a thread to help people not just understand what happened on the morning of October 7th and in those initial weeks of war, but what it felt like to be there on the ground. Because I think that's a really important part of storytelling, to make people empathize with the Israeli people on that morning, to make people empathize with the Palestinian civilians who have now survived nearly a year of war, and to understand that this was the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. And to grasp just how large of an attack it was, you have to read the pages of this book to understand not just what I saw, but what these people saw in southern Israel on that day, to really get how bad it was.
Yeah, there's another point where you described finishing I think maybe you had just filed your first report, and you say, we finished our brief reporting and pushed on towards Sderot. By now, we'd seen one video circulating online, Hamas fighters in the city. We assumed that the army or the police would have taken care of them by the time that we arrived. And this was something that I'd found as well. So I was over there in November reporting on this. We did an extended series podcast about the Israel-Palestine conflict afterwards. But it struck me as well that there was such a reflexive assumption, I think, from people who lived there, obviously from Israeli citizens, that whatever's happening is bad, but the IDF's on the way, because this was like 7:30 in the morning. Like, the IDF's on the way. They're going to tamp it down. And that didn't happen at all. Looking back, like, what do you think about that assumption? Why was that assumption so strong, even in you, as you describe in the book?
The Israeli military is touted as the best and most advanced in the world. And in many ways, as we've seen in recent weeks, they have the intelligence capabilities really as the most advanced in the world. But on that day, something went wrong. There was an intelligence failure. And that's not something that I expected or something that anyone here expected to happen. The Palestinians didn't expect it to happen, and Hamas certainly didn't expect it to happen. Hamas expected to face much more resistance. Some of the people who spoke out, who actually participated in the massacre afterwards, said that they were surprised of how easily they walked into these communities. And so there was a thought that if anything like this ever happened, that the military would be there, the police would be there right away. And we should note that some police and some army soldiers did respond, but they just didn't have enough. They didn't have enough people. They didn't have enough ammunition. And recent reporting and Israeli officials indicates that upwards of 6,000. When I wrote the book, the number was estimated to be at 3,000, but they've since analyzed more video and data that they gathered about the massacre. We're talking about thousands of gunmen entering into southern Israel on a Saturday morning and catching the entire country by surprise. And so not only were the people who were trying to survive on that day surprised, even the top levels of the Israeli military were surprised, including Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who I interview a number of times in the course of the reporting for Black Saturday to try and get an understanding of how this could happen.
Yeah, no, it is striking, because it's not just that they didn't respond quickly enough, or they didn't understand quickly enough. It also seems very clear, like, they didn't have the assets in place that were necessary. They didn't have a sense that Hamas would have had this kind of capability, which I think it attributes to so much of the shock.
Yeah, certainly. And there are so many stories of soldiers and police officers running out of ammunition. And you think of just how horrifying that experience was, to be in a firefight, trying to survive, trying to protect your family or your community, and to run out of bullets to keep fighting during an attack like we saw on October 7th. And we saw something similar when we were there. I mean, there were civilians and police officers, oftentimes just by themselves, responding in any way they could at this intersection we reported from on that morning. And you could see in their eyes how scared they were. We were scared. We
Sure.
were scared, and we didn't even understand the scope of the attack. No one did at that time, because it took days to really understand how many communities were attacked. And it also took days to grasp the scale of the attack. I mean, there were communities that after 24 hours still weren't cleared of Hamas gunmen. And the army was still trying to figure out, okay, what are the orders to go in? And that's why, and I described this in Black Saturday, some of the soldiers that I talked to, they said they just responded. They had no plan. They had no commands from officers. They grabbed what weapons and ammunition that they had, and they headed toward Gaza. That was the extent of the operation of the Israeli army that day. And that led to a lot of confusion. It also led to some friendly fire incidents along the border, and just chaos on that morning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you describe that being at that roadside stop. You say this, you say, we had a decision to make, go forward or stay put. We could get to Sderot the back way. As the correspondent on the team, it was my call. I thought back to when I'd first arrived in the region 5 years earlier. I was taught how to get around areas like this, driving through fields and dirt roads. Something in my gut told me not to push it today. Tell me about that gut feeling. What was that gut feeling that made you stay where you were, and why did that end up being a good decision?
It ended up being a good decision because had we driven just one intersection further, we would have been ambushed and killed by Hamas. And that's something I think about a lot, because I don't know how I would have reacted in an ambush, especially because I was driving and I was in a Jeep, not a bulletproof vehicle.
Right.
And I think that there are a variety of outcomes, but none of them are good. And so I think about that day a lot. I also just think about that decision, because it truly was one decision that changed the entire course of my life. And every decision does in some capacity, but some hold more weight than others. And, you know, I'm not a very religious person. I would say I'm sometimes spiritual. I mean, I grew up twice a year with the same grandmother that I wrote about in the book, going to church at Easter and at Christmas. Mm-hmm. But sometimes you think, okay, well, how much control do I have over this situation? And, you know, you make a decision and it changes the course of your life. And for me, it's something that I truly do. And I write about this in Black Saturday. I think about it every day because it really saved not just my life, but the lives of my team members who were with me and would have gone down that road. And since then, we've actually driven from that intersection to the next one. And every single time in my head, sometimes on my phone, I time it. It's less than a minute. That's how close we were.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.